Okay, so I thought we should begin this session by basically summarizing the arguments of David's essay, There Never Was a West. I think there are 5 arguments, and I would summarize them this way. David argues that it is a false assumption that democracy is a Western concept that began in ancient Greece and was fully realized in Western Europe and North America in the 18th and 19th centuries. Parallel to that, he suggests that this concept, Western civilization, is incoherent and that it is an invented intellectual tradition. That's the first argument. The second is, and this, of course, is an idea that's very central to David's work, democratic and egalitarian processes of decision-making occur everywhere. They occur in all traditions. They occur in all cultures, all civilizations around the world, certainly not just in the so-called West. Okay, so that's a second argument. The third is that in the 19th and 20th centuries, elite politicians and intellectuals, most everywhere, but especially in the West, created their own self-serving genealogies of democracy, which they then linked in that time period to the coercive mechanisms of the state. That's a quotation from David. These societies are not democratic, but they do have democratic elements. Democracy without coercion is, as opposed to democracy with coercion, this is a crucial distinction in David's thinking. So that's point number 3. The fourth point is that the contemporary crisis of democracy, now he's writing in 2007, and in many ways he was prescient because the crisis of democracy has only worsened since then. The contemporary crisis of democracy is a crisis of the state. That's argument number 4. And then finally, he suggests, this is very much in keeping with his own experience, that most democratic practices emerge from global social movements. And he adds that these global social movements represent the future of the concept. Without those movements, the very ideas and practices of democracy will not be renewed. In other words, this has to happen from the bottom up. Okay, so I think those are the 5 main arguments of the essay, just to get everybody on the same page. I'm not sure how recently everyone has read it. Now, in my view, the essay holds up very well after 17 years. He wrote it a good while ago, but it holds up very well. One major reason for this is that lots of new research has been done on subjects he treats in the essay. Some of that work was done by David himself, I might add, and that these support the fundamental arguments of the essay. For example, the broad and fierce attack on Eurocentrism, which has been going on for a while. Now, this is not identical to David's purpose, but it is similar. And we do all know that the attacks on Eurocentrism have come from many different quarters with quite devastating results. Now, this doesn't mean that intellectuals and politicians in Western Europe and the United States don't continue to use this Eurocentric model. It still remains quite powerful and in many ways dominant, but the dissenting voices have been strong. Okay, now in this essay, I'm happy to say, and not surprised to say, we see a lot of David's characteristic traits as both a writer and a thinker. For example, the deep and wide-ranging erudition. He's very knowledgeable about many different parts of the world over a very broad span of time. We see lots of wit and humor. we see, and this I kind of find fascinating, we see a really intimate relationship with the reader. He has a way of entering into conversations with the reader that are quite compelling. And then finally, I would say that David possesses very sharp, and I would actually say cutting polemical skills. This is a bit of a lost art, to be able to write a polemic. He was really good at it. And of course, anyone who has done this kind of work knows, excuse me, knows that a new idea is worth a forceful exaggeration. So let me give you an example of the humor. Excuse me. One example of the humor that I liked very much: a common definition of civilization, David says, is basically, quote, people reading one another's books, end quote. And of course, that makes the very idea of civilization sound ridiculous, as if life could be reduced to printed texts. Of course it can. And I'll just add that David is a very charming companion on any political or intellectual voyage, and that is true in this case. I would also add that we can see some of the ideas in this essay that will emerge with full force in The Dawn of Everything, Pirate Enlightenment, and other subsequent writings. Okay, so the main purpose of the essay, as I read it, is to offer a new genealogy of democracy. In other words, to reclaim the concept for the people who really created the concept. And he does this by delinking democracy from Western civilization and suggesting instead that the idea emerges from below and, crucially, this is a big part of his argument, in what he calls the spaces in between, from indigenous societies, from frontiers, and from tall ships at sea, among many other places. Now, let me give you a quote which I think sums up David's argument. Quote, democratic practice, whether defined as procedures of egalitarian decision-making or government by public discussion, tends to emerge from situations in which communities of one sort or another manage their own affairs outside the purview of the state, end quote. And I would add that in some important instances, democracy emerges when those groups manage their own affairs against the state, not just apart for it, but consciously against it. Now, one example of this decision-making space that is very dear to my heart and also was dear to David's is the pirate ship. He calls the pirate ship, and I must say I love this, the perfect intercultural space of experiment. And I must say, I always regarded what happened on these pirate ships as a huge social experiment. Now, to the extent that David draws upon my research in making many of the arguments about the pirate ship and democracy, I have to say he is completely right. I say that jokingly. But I would also point to the fact that his thought evolved over time. In other words, he said in this essay that we have no evidence that pirate democracy influenced Western democratic theory or philosophy. But of course, we do have evidence of that. And David himself would change his mind about this 15 years later when he's writing Pirate Enlightenment. So we do see connections between this democratic experiment from below, which is carried around the Atlantic by working class people, mostly sailors, and you see it enter democratic discourse and practice in lots of other places. Now, I want to make a comparison here, and I'll do this again later in the talk, between this essay and a book that Peter Linebaugh and I wrote called The Many-Head Hydra: Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic, which was published in the year 2000. This book has a lot of affinities with David's essay and with other parts of his work, but here's how Peter and I handled this issue of democracy from below, especially as it related to pirate ships. We showed that the pirate ship was part of a much broader tradition of maritime radicalism. In other words, that it came out of the culture of ordinary working sailors as they traveled all around the Atlantic and even beyond in the 17th and the 18th centuries. And what this tradition of maritime radicalism allowed us to see, by the way, we called it hydrarchy, which means the government, self-government on the waters. We called it hydrarchy. What this allowed us to see was an unusual set of connections that had previously been considered to be completely separate. I'm referring here to the English Revolution, to piracy, to urban riots led by sailors, to slave revolts, to strikes. And by the way, I hope all of you know the strike was in fact invented by sailors in 1768, but also connections to mutinies, and then to, in the later 18th and early 19th century, the entire age of revolution. So the pirate ship was actually part of something much bigger, something that had much greater reach, geographical reach, and much greater influence. And as I've said, we call this hydrarchy, meaning the self-organization of seafaring people from below. Now, another concept which we use, which David doesn't use, but I think his thinking is very much in keeping with this. Another concept that proved useful to us is motley crew. Now, motley crew was a force on ships in port cities and around the Atlantic in the 18th century and after. And what the value of this, in my view, was that motley crew allowed us to think heterogeneity within the context of the work group, in the context of a group that had a specific appointed task, like sailing a ship or unloading a ship, or more subversively, leading uprisings in these port cities, which the motley crew frequently did. Now, motley crew means a multi-ethnic and multiracial combination of people. And I think this is a revolutionary subject in the 18th and 19th century. Very important. And like I say, even though David doesn't use that phrase, I think the same conception of motley humanity is very central to his vision. Okay, so let's talk now about a few specifics of the essay. The essay begins, I think, very effectively with a takedown of a book by a man named Samuel Huntington. It is called The Clash of Civilizations. I think David's critique of this is probably the best I've ever read. But if it was, as David says, ridiculously easy to refute Huntington in 2007, it's even easier today. Respectable thinkers do not take his theory of the clash of civilization seriously anymore, and part of this is because of David's critique. So I would suggest we not spend too much time on this part of the essay. Here are some other important points, in my view, that emerge from the essay. First of all, the makers of Western civilization not only sanitized, but nationalized their own history refusing to acknowledge their connections to the rest of the world. David said these histories are very entangled. That's a word that he uses. And that entanglement was basically kept out of the national histories. Now, I might add, imperialism is a very good thing to try to hide. And if you're going to talk about relations to other parts of the world, whether you're in Britain, France, Spain, the United States, you're going to have to talk about imperialism. I also like David's critique of the methodological individualism of what he calls the Western eye, or could call it the Western gaze. One big example of which was his own discipline, that is anthropology, which was inextricably tied to colonizing projects from its very beginning. So the individualizing eye has very serious consequences for how one can understand democracy, because that individualizing eye cannot comprehend the collective practices of people outside of Europe. But it could reduce, and it did reduce, those societies outside of Europe to objects of violence and domination. That's another very interesting idea that comes out of this book. It is also true, as David says, that the founding fathers of the United States, people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, that early generation, they were very aristocratic, and they were, most of them, enslavers. And they were absolutely terrified by the idea and the practice of democracy. He's absolutely right about this. They're reading in classical political theory, for example, in antiquity, Greek and Roman antiquity made them very fearful of democracy. They were also very fearful of the idea of equality. That's very important to know. And they did, as David says, see democracy as essentially mob rule. Even more precisely, I think, they saw it as sheer anarchy, that if the lower classes should ever gain political power, that would mean sheer anarchy. Now, those lower classes were frequently organized, well organized among themselves. The disorder they would have created would have been for the upper class. And this, of course, is why they detested the concept of democracy so much. Now, excuse me. This brings up a larger point, which I think is very important in the essay. Neither democracy nor equality will ever come from above. And there's a pretty simple reason why. Those up above may grant certain democratic rights under pressure, under fierce pressure, but they will never grant them as a gift, because those things, ideas of democracy and equality, must come from below because they are checks on ruling class power. Really important to say that. Okay, so these are all very important parts of this essay. And as I say, it reads very well these many years later. I find a great deal to agree with it, but I do have 3 criticisms I want to make. I don't think they undermine the central arguments, but they invite us to think a little bit differently about some of the themes that David has raised. One thing that I think is largely missing from the essay in this analysis is the history of capitalism. The word capitalism appears in the essay only 4 times, and 3 of the times come when David is talking about a debate about the origins of capitalism. I think it would be safe to say that capitalism is really not part of the theoretical apparatus for analyzing either democracy or Western civilization. And I think this is a shame, because I think we do need that concept, because it was precisely in this context of the global rise of capitalism that modern conceptions of democracy, even the statist conceptions of democracy, however limited they were, and they were limited, those conceptions in Western civilization were originally formed within that broader economic context of the rise of capitalism. Now, I don't entirely agree with David that there never was a West, although I accept many of the points he makes about it. I think there was a material social formation called or self-called the West, and that the core of this is not democracy, no matter how self-serving the genealogy may have been, but rather the far-reaching practices of global capitalism, the violent practices of global capitalism. This is the core of the West. This is its core. As these rapacious imperial states on the western edge of Eurasia, it's a tiny part of the world. You look at it on the map. As they built these blue water empires in the 17th and the 18th century, they dressed themselves up as the forebears of democracy in order to hide the bloody origins of capitalism. In other words, they could present their project as a hopeful one for humanity rather than showing what it was. It was a violent project in which millions of people were expropriated from the land. It was a project in which the destruction of the commons was at its very heart in many parts of the world. It was a project of building two systems, a plantation system and a factory system, which were always closely interlinked. All of these things are based on violence. We need to remember that, based on extreme violence, expropriation, and exploitation. And to this extent, I'd say that the concept of violence is also underplayed in this book. Not that David didn't know about it, but it wasn't really central to the argument. Now, in The Many-Headed Hydra, violence was kind of the centerpiece of the book. Peter Linebaugh and I, chronicled one slaughter after another, one massacre after another, one mass hanging after another. And of course, what we were showing was that capitalism came into the world with blood dripping from every pore, as Karl Marx famously put it. This is crucial to the process of resistance, and it is also crucial to the formation of new alternative ideas and practices. During this time of extreme violence, it's a remarkable fact that the practices of democracy and equality nonetheless advanced and spread over a very broad space and over a long period of time by social movements of many different kinds that were all connected to Atlantic capitalism. Now, rulers in this process saw themselves as Hercules as they tried to build transatlantic capitalism. But of course, in building it, they had extreme problems trying to control the motley crew, the many-headed hydra, the sailors, the enslaved, indentured servants, factory workers, women, domestic workers. They said it's like trying to slay a hydra. And the idea was, in that myth, that classical myth, you cut off one head and two new heads pop up somewhere else. This is really important. And to give an example of how this worked at the level of intellectual history and even elite intellectual history, the French philosopher Montaigne wrote a radical humanist critique of imperialism in 1580, the very moment when capitalism is breaking out and moving around the world, wrote an essay called Of Cannibals. And the theme of this essay is that the indigenous people were not cannibals, but that's, of course, what colonizers had been calling them to justify their slaughter and enslavement. Montaigne said, no, that's not true. it's the European colonizers who are the cannibals. Now, how did he come to this conclusion? It's kind of a fascinating circuit. It turns out that Montaigne had a servant who had worked as a sailor and had sailed to Brazil, where he had gotten to know a lot of these indigenous people. So he explained what they were really like to Montaigne. And what he said to them is that these are stateless, kingless, free people, freer than anybody in Europe. And now they are under attack from these colonizers. And this is the circuit by which Montaigne created this very famous critique of imperialism, all happening during this moment of the origins of capitalism. So that's the first point. I think we need a little more on the history of capitalism. Secondly, I think we need a little more history from below. Now, David is committed to that. And here's something that he writes, just to prove that. The democratic ideal did not emerge from the Western literary philosophical tradition. It was rather imposed on it, end quote. It was imposed from below. But do we get enough of who did the imposing and how they did it? We need more history from below to demonstrate not only the origins of democratic ideals, but the agency of people who were fighting to make those ideas real. Okay. Now, here, a prime example in my work has been the radical democratic and egalitarian ideas of religious radicals in the English Revolution in the 1640s and 1650s. People called the levelers, the diggers, the ranters, the seekers, the Muggletonians, the Quakers. The Quakers came here too, all of whom are crucial to an alternative genealogy of democracy. Most people still don't know that these radical Protestant groups advanced ideas of communism, they advanced ideas of abolitionism, they advanced anti-war ideas, they advanced feminist ideas. They were unbelievably modern and far ahead of their time, certainly much further ahead of their time than the French Revolution. Now, these 17th century radical thinkers had a huge influence in their own day and on subsequent philosophical thought, on John Locke, for example, who in many ways was in dialogue with the levelers, and on many other mainstream thinkers. But then what happened was that these radical thinkers were basically erased from history. They were known, but nobody really appreciated what they had done until Christopher Hill, the great Marxist historian Christopher Hill, wrote a book. I would highly recommend it to everybody here. It's called The World Turned Upside Down, Radical Ideas During the English Revolution, published in 1972. And what Hill shows is that these thinkers need to be taken seriously. Now, they were a motley crew themselves. They were sailors, they were dispossessed commoners, some were the middling sort, but they had very radical ideas. So this is really important to the genealogy of democracy. Those ideas will come back up. This is one of the arguments of the many-headed hydra in subsequent rebellions and resistance movements in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So this is kind of a moment of origin. Something similar happens in the American Revolution, in which history from below played a role that we don't fully appreciate in most cases. This is a chapter in the Many-Headed Hydra about the motley crew in the American Revolution. Basically, it was the resistance of sailors, usually in mobs, crowds, urban protests, and the resistance of enslaved people in slave revolts that propelled the 13 colonies toward the Declaration of Independence in 1776. What happened was when elites regained control of the movement, they wanted to divide the motley crew, and they did so using conceptions of citizenship. Sailors didn't own property and couldn't be citizens. Enslaved people certainly couldn't be citizens. So again, the division of the movement from above, divide and conquer, is really important, but the agency in creating this movement towards radical change happened from below, happening in social movements, but not exactly in the spaces in between. This is actually taking place, we would say, in the belly of the beast. Okay, and then the third and final criticism is that I don't think David says enough about the racial dimensions of Western civilization. And here, I would urge everybody to remember a quite extraordinary book by Martin Bernal, the late Martin Bernal, who wrote a book called Black Athena, which is all about how Western Europeans, beginning in the late 18th century, systematically removed all African influences on the ancient world in order to whiten that tradition. This is part of the building of the genealogy that David critiques Western civilization. It would be a white civilization. Now, I find that race is also insufficiently emphasized. For example, scientific racism and white supremacy destroyed many ideas of democracy from below. That's important. And then in a new phase, a new transatlantic phase of imperialism, David has this to say, and it's absolutely true and it's very important. It was only in the 1890s when Europeans began to see the United States as part of the same co-equal civilization, and many then started using the term democracy in its current sense. Okay, but we got to sort of get back behind this connection between Great Britain and the United States in the 1890s. The basis for their rapprochement was something called racial Anglo-Saxonism, that they were descended from the same white Anglo-Saxon tribe. This meant that both countries could now be united in bringing to the so-called darker peoples of the world their superior, ingenious, freedom-loving, democratic institutions. This would be the gift of a superior race to the rest of the world. So these are three issues I think we could discuss: the history of capitalism, history from below, racialized democracy. You may have other themes from the essay you'd like to talk about, but I would like to conclude with one question. Let's agree with David that a proper genealogy of democracy can only be understood from below, and that its real practices, the real practices of democracy, emerge primarily from social movements. Let's admit that. Okay. What is the practical implication of that truth in a time when the limited forms of bourgeois representative democracy are under attack and in retreat in so many other parts of the world? And of course, we have many examples of that at hand. Okay, I'll stop right there and we can turn to discussion.
Thank you so much, Marcus. So if anybody wants to ask question or to comment, so please raise your hand, or you can post it in chat. So if anyone wants to speak. Thank you so much, Marcus. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Anyone? I just see like people saying fantastic.
I had a question. It might be a little off topic, but related. So I read David's last book, and I was struck by comments he was making, or statements made in that book about the limits of centralized control and authority, and the ability, and agreed with that, to move further away from the ability of that centralized control to project power. And I wonder how that observation in that later book might be reflected in this essay in your discussion around multiracial, multi-ethnic pirates, the motley crew phenomenon, and that kind of almost self-organizing.
Yeah, and I think it's not accidental that a lot of the radical democratic experiments took place at sea, because that was the hardest place for these imperial states to control. Not that they don't try. They try to project their sovereignty onto the ships, but the oceans of the world are so vast, and you don't really have at that time the kind of technology that will allow you to control people who are vast distances away at sea and out from under the institutional control of the state. So I think we could push this point further. Maroon communities. These are places where enslaved people ran away to build, autonomous worlds apart from the plantation. They frequently built them in mountainous terrain. Mountains are very much like the oceans, that the authorities can't project their power there very easily. So I do think we need there's been good work on this. We need a kind of geographical conception of freedom and democracy and equality. These autonomous spaces are really, really important.
Great, thank you.
So Brandon Murphy is asking, thank you, Marcus, great talk. Can you tell us more about the piratical influence on the formation of the US?
Yes, actually this is a very direct connection. Pirates are basically suppressed in the 1720s, right? The golden age of pirates is, it's roughly 1670 to about 1730, but the third and final generation of pirates, which I write about and which David writes about, they're basically, most of them eliminated, not the ones who went to Madagascar, but the ones who stayed in the Atlantic by about 1730, okay? By the 1740s, there are massive riots in North American cities over the impressment of sailors into the Royal Navy. These press gangs would go ashore and literally see a sailor or any working person on the waterfront and just literally hit them with a club and carry them back to the ship. It was a kind of slavery, in fact. But what happened was sailors, some of whom I'm sure were on these pirate ships, began to organize crowds to fight the press gangs in the street. This is really fascinating. Now, that in itself is important, but there's this young guy named Samuel Adams, who 30 years later will end up being a leader of the American Revolution. He's in Boston, where a lot of these battles in the street are taking place. And what he does is he writes an article for a local newspaper, and he says, these sailors are defending the rights of democracy in the streets. He says they are proving the equality of all people. See, he couldn't say that they were proving the rights of Englishmen because they weren't all English. They were a motley crew. So that forced his thinking into a more radical channel of the rights of human beings. And this language, the language is kind of shockingly similar, is exactly what Jefferson draws on in writing the Declaration of Independence. So there you have a circulation from a pirate ship to a portside mob to political discourse and the coming of revolution.
Thank you. Stas, you want to ask a question?
Hi, Marcus. I like riding on a pirate wave. In the end of the essay, David talks about agoraphobia and the circus. about how it is necessary to scare people away from democracy, and therefore media is purging any displays of agora and instead promotes pictures of a circus, that picture of a purge where like democracy is presented in a form that people wouldn't want to pursue. Does a picture of a media picture of a pirate is that part of a circus, ugly mirror, how David calls it?
Well, look, the point that you're making is really crucial. The forces of democracy throughout the early modern era were presented as a monster, a many-headed hydra. Now, they didn't have images that they could show, although they did draw great many illustrations of the many-headed hydra. But there were many terms of insult to try to marginalize and rationalize the punishment of rebellious people. So this, I think, is more or less constant over time, and especially this use of monstrosity. This is really critical. So in this sense, the pirate is one example. The pirate was a real monster to the authorities, and a very dangerous one, and not just because they attacked the ships of wealthy merchants, because they dared to live in a democratic and egalitarian way. Now, there's a funny twist to this, because in popular culture, pirates are depicted now as a man missing a hand and has a hook, and missing a leg and has a peg leg, and missing an eye and has an eye patch, and has a parrot on his shoulder. What's fascinating to me is that all of those things can be linked to the difficulty of the working life of sailors, in which people were constantly maimed, right? So even in the stereotype, there's kind of a deep truth as they try to de-radicalize the pirate for popular culture, and especially for the consumption of children. It is nonetheless true that history of violence remains there. So I think this idea of scaring people from the practices and realities of democracy is real, and it's a very old tactic.
Any more questions? Then, Scott, do you want to ask yourself?
Yeah, sorry if there's any background noise here. Yeah, it's just a comment that the mention of mountains as a space that's harder for the state to control reminded me of the Zapatistas as a potential recent example.
Absolutely right. It's a perfect modern example. But here's the problem. These autonomous spaces are, with all of the new technologies, drone technology, especially, these autonomous spaces are getting harder and harder to find. So let's realize that the authorities recognize that, and that they want to eliminate these autonomous spaces. They want actually to crush the examples of people who live in new and challenging ways. This has also been a constant pretty much throughout history, the use of violence to suppress alternative communities. I think everybody knows about that. So yeah, I think the Zapatistas are a very good example.
Yeah, I also want to add Rojava that David was writing so much about. And he was specifically saying that Rojava is crushed because it's democratic and feminist and peaceful. And this is an example that should be punished for that particular reason. Edwin Everhart, please. Sorry if I pronounce the name incorrectly.
Okay, it's very wonderful. I remember a lecture that Naoki Sakai was giving. He's a literary scholar of Japanese literature and other things. And he had this point that the West is the bankrupt concept that is just very, very empty. and that it's this mere distinction against Asia in his discussion, and it's just merely a cardinal direction. And so this seems like it's emphasizes the extent to which it's a distinction. It's versus the other. It's
Yeah, yeah.
like with whiteness, it's invented at a moment of like creating a new kind of oppression, and but it's quite empty as a signifier. And I was, I wasn't necessarily expecting David's article to be citing Sakai, but just there seems to be consensus that the West is a bogus idea. So
I think that's true. And you can look at other examples of your point. We could talk about Edward Said and Orientalism. In other words, that one of the power moves of Western civilization is to denigrate, for the sake of domination, all of the other civilizations and cultures out there. It is really a move for superiority. And I think the relationship with Japan does illuminate that. Thank you.
John is asking, how do you fit into this narrative of democracy from below the many instances of rapprochement of motley crew type groups with the imperial state, such as the privateer, the state-recognized Maroons communities, even someone like Thomas Paine?
Yeah, I would say that co-optation is always a potential issue. That one of the things that rulers did in Jamaica, for example, was to recognize the autonomy of certain Maroon groups if they would act as a police force and return fugitives back to the plantations. So this is true. This is true. Privateer is another example. The state will try to use the motley crew whenever it can, and it does successfully do that. But here's the important point, and I think David understood this very well. When you organize the cooperation of people, their work to serve capital and the state, once they are organized among themselves, they can do something else with that cooperation. And this is the kind of dialectical beauty of it, that the hands, as sailors were called, who sailed the ships that created massive capital accumulation, would join hands in a mutiny or an uprising and building a pirate ship. That is totally unauthorized cooperation. So I think we need to keep that in mind. It's always a struggle. Solidarity is never automatic, never structural, never to be taken for example. It has to be worked for, it has to be built, and it has to be reproduced. It's all highly situational, based on what people think they can do. And this is another thing. Even though those Maroons acted as a kind of police force, they were nonetheless a tremendous inspiration for other freedom seekers. In other words, it's not just one or the other. You can have it both ways. And I think pirates were a tremendous epitome of freedom for the common sailor and for lots of others. Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister in Boston, would give speeches at the hangings of pirates. And then he would go home and write in his journal, why does everybody see these people as heroes? They did see them as heroes. They stood up to the powers that be, and they would turn out for these hangings, partly just to cheer them, which is why there were always armed soldiers in front of the gallows to keep them from rescuing pirates before they were hanged.
So we can take one last question. Who wants to ask? Simeon Gallo, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, it's just about the in the many-headed Hydra. There was when you talk about the ideas from the revolution, the Christopher Hill stuff circulating, was that basically people who'd been arrested and transported, or were there actually pamphlets and manuscripts that were circulating? I'd asked a historian in England who was actually kind of a cavalier historian. And he said, no, of course not. No such thing ever existed. But do you know, is there archival stuff about that?
There's not much archival stuff, but what there is a lot of documentation of extremely worried elites
Yeah.
who will say that there's an uprising of indentured servants in
Mm.
Virginia in 1672,
Mm.
and the authorities say, "Oh my God, it's levelers and diggers and ranters. It's all of those people. They've
Right.
come over here." Now, some of those people were arrested, and then because of the labor shortage in the New World, they were shipped over there as indentured servants. But other radicals traveled freely.
Mm.
Some people joined the military, joined the Navy or the Army, and then when they get to a place like Jamaica, they desert, and so the ideas come ashore in their bodies. So I guess I would come back here to David's point that civilization is not just about reading pamphlets.
Right.
That the ideas are carried in people's memories and in their practices. You have white sailors joining maroon communities occasionally. It's kind of fascinating. So we just gotta think more about how radical ideas circulate in ways that aren't often captured in the documentary record.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, you tell that to your cavalier historian.
Yeah, I will. Okay.
Thank you so much, Marcus. So yeah, thank you. We released this as a video on our YouTube channel, and and then just hope to see you again sometimes in the institute.
Thanks to
Bye-bye.
everybody from turning out, and let me just say, keep the spirit of David Graeber alive.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.